you're a tired, burnt out, exhausted, overwhelmed mama, well, listen up. This one thing could be robbing you of your precious energy in motherhood. And it's a major factor that I see contributing to the postnatal depletion and exhaustion so many of us mothers are experiencing. So what exactly am I talking about? Well, it's stress. Yes, big old bad stress. There's lots to unpack here, so just hang tight. We'll go through it all together in just a moment. Hey mama, welcome back for another video, or welcome here if this is your first time. I'm Georgie and I'm a naturopath for tired mums, and I help tired, run down, exhausted mums just like you to survive sleep deprivation, overcome exhaustion, and rediscover themselves in motherhood. In this video, I'll be exploring why it's so important to understand stress and the effect that it has on your body, particularly on your energy levels in motherhood. Before we jump in, if you are a tired mum, you're going to want to grab a copy of my free guide. It's a 7-step guide for boosting your energy and overcoming exhaustion in motherhood, even if you have a wakeful baby. I've popped the link just at the top of the description box down below. So after this video, head over there and grab your copy. All right, let's jump in. So it might be good to sort of set the stage and talk about what stress is and how that shows up for us in motherhood before we then move on into talking about how it actually depletes our energy and impacts our health. Stress is defined slightly differently by different people, but really what we're talking about in a physiological sense is when we're exposed to some sort of trigger or stimulus that causes a shift to our homeostasis, which is the body's natural sense of being in balance. Stress can also be thought of as anything that triggers the stress response, which is a system and cascade of reactions in the body that help us to respond to this external stimulus. Stress is not inherently a bad thing. It's often spoken about like it's always a negative thing, but it's inevitable in daily life for us to be exposed to stresses or to have a stress response. It's a natural part of just going about our day. We want that and we expect it. It's when we're exposed to chronic stress or ongoing stress, unrelenting stress, or really stuck in a state of stress, the stress response is stuck in a state of activation. That's when problems can arise. That's when it moves from just being a normal response of our physiology into something that starts to negatively impact our health. It's important to remember that stress comes in many shapes and forms. We can have physical stress, so stresses that might be happening internally on a biological level, as well as emotional or psychological stresses, so things that might be worrying us or from a mental emotional perspective we perceive to be threatening or concerning, things like our finances, our relationships, work deadlines. Physiologically speaking, some stresses or things that the body perceives to be a stress internally, physically speaking, are things like blood sugar imbalances, so blood sugar going too high or too low, chronic conditions or disease states that might be playing out in the body, inflammatory processes or allergies, activation of the immune system, body composition and metabolic health are all kinds of things that the body might perceive to be physically a stressful thing. The stress response in the body involves primarily the adrenal glands, the adrenal system, as well as the nervous system. The adrenal glands are really told what to do in terms of this stress response by the brain. So it really starts up in the brain and we get hormonal messages sent down to the adrenal glands telling them, activate stress response. We really need to respond to this stressful situation. They release cortisol, maybe adrenaline, and the body has that physiological response. So it starts up here in the brain at the hypothalamus. Then there's a message sent to the pituitary and then down to the adrenal glands. And this is referred to as the HPA axis, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis. Cortisol and adrenaline are things that we want to have. They're not inherently bad, but when we see chronically high levels or even things can swing in the other direction and we get actually our levels sort of bottoming out or really low, in motherhood, stress comes in so many different forms. One might argue that motherhood is an inherently stressful time, and I think that that is true to some extent. There are new and novel physical demands on our body when we become mothers. We are recovering from birth, maybe breastfeeding, sleep deprivation, and the very physical nature of caring for a baby. So that can be a stress for us. And then of course, emotionally, psychologically, that transition into motherhood or matrescence can be very stressful, depending on what that experience is like for us. And there are so many other things, in between this, even as our babies grow up and get older, new stresses are going to come up as they become more mobile, more independent, as we return to work, as we're juggling more in our domestic responsibilities. There's relationship challenges, as you and your partner become parents. There's so many things in this unique experience of becoming a mother that can be stressful for you physically and psychologically. So how does stress rob us of our energy in motherhood? So there are really two states that we might see. And I mean, it's never black and white, like it's either one or the other, but it can be useful to categorize them into these two different states to explain how stress can rob us of our energy in motherhood. So firstly, we might see and in both states, we're talking about dysregulated HPA axis function. So we might see like low cortisol output, where the adrenal glands are really not responding to that message coming from the brain. Or we might see high cortisol states, where the adrenal glands, or the stress response system in general, is upregulated, it's activated, it's quite sensitive, quite hyper responsive. So if we start by looking at that more low cortisol output, this is like typically what you're thinking about in that kind of burnout, depleted kind of state. And fatigue is a really common experience for people who have low cortisol or who are burnt out. And this is because cortisol itself, as we said before, it's not a bad guy, we want to have it there. It's involved in, keeping us energized via the production of glucose. And glucose is a molecule that is used by a majority of our cells in our body as its preferred fuel source. So when we have low cortisol, we have impaired glucose levels and therefore lower actual energy substrate for our cells to do their thing. We often have dysregulated blood sugar levels, usually looking at kind of a low blood sugar picture. So the body's really struggling to keep those levels where they are. And fatigue is a natural byproduct of that. We might also see cravings, particularly for sweet foods, because the body is trying, to find a way to boost up those glucose levels itself through the carbohydrate foods or the sweet and sugary foods. And it can be very difficult to resist these cravings. They can be really intense, but the trouble is if we do satisfy these cravings with sugary foods, it can often make the whole situation worse. It's also thought that in a low cortisol state, we might see some alterations of our neurotransmitter levels. As I said, there's that interaction, that communication between the adrenal system, the adrenal glands, and the nervous system, particularly around things like serotonin levels. And so we might end up starting to see an impact on our sleep quality. Serotonin is the precursor to melatonin. Melatonin is needed for good quality sleep across the night. And then we get lower energy levels because we're not getting that restorative sleep across the night, regardless of if we have a wakeful baby or not. On the other hand, in our higher cortisol states, where that HPA axis is switched on, it's hyperreactive, you're kind of sitting up high in the high stress state a lot of the time, then that can also impair our energy by some different mechanisms. Firstly, when we are in that high chronic stress state, we churn through a lot of really valuable vitamins and minerals, things like our vitamin C, which is needed to produce cortisol in the adrenal gland, magnesium, which is also required for that stress response in high levels, our B vitamins and zinc, as well as our electrolytes like sodium, potassium, and magnesium's an electrolyte too. That group of nutrients can really become depleted if we don't keep up with the higher need while we're in a high cortisol, high stress state. So when we are stressed, we actually have an increased need for these type of nutrients to be able to keep up with all these processes and production of hormones and other molecules to regulate the system than we would if we were in like a nice balanced baseline state. When our nutrient levels start to become depleted, that can impact our energy levels via energy production pathways in sort of different systems. High stress, high cortisol also starts to downregulate thyroid hormone production. So our thyroid being that master of metabolism gland, it's really like pulling the strings of so many cellular functions, including energy production. And so once thyroid function starts to become downregulated, so too does our energy levels. High cortisol will also promote an insulin resistant type state, which means that it's very difficult for the cells to take up that glucose, like we talked about just before, into the cell to use as energy to meet all the cell's needs, which again can manifest as exhaustion, low energy. And finally, high cortisol levels, or that high stress state, is very likely to impact our digestive function. We can either be in that fight or flight, or we can be more in that rest and digest, so the really calmed down version. And so that's where we want to be for digestion, is in rest and digest. We want stress response switched off so that the vagus nerve, which innervates the digestive system, can come online and do its thing to help us get the most from the food we're eating. In the high stress state, that digestive function is really switched off in lots of ways, which really impairs how much nutrition we're able to extract from the food that we're eating, which can play further into that nutrient depleted state that we just touched on, impacting our energy. So that's the overview of how stress might be robbing you of your energy in motherhood. It's a big topic. I could have gone on for a lot longer, especially around some of the things we can do to support and heal. Perhaps that's a topic for the next video. But hopefully this has helped you to understand why it's so important to be aware of stress, how it impacts our physiology and our energy, and some of those things to start thinking about to move the needle in the right direction. Don't forget that free guide I mentioned at the beginning. It's linked just at the top of the description box down here. It contains 7 simple, really straightforward, everyday strategies that you can use to increase your energy, many of which relate to managing our stress or moderating our stress. So go over and grab your copy now. That's all from me today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.